laggards initially, but grew pretty rapidly, and their lights grew by 9% over this time period, very fast, and caught up, came pretty close to where the initially traditionally well-developed regions, districts were. And slowdowns are those that were traditionally well-developed. Like if you see the colors, you'll find that Maharashtra, Gujarat, the Punjab, NCR, Haryana belt, the industrialized parts of UP, parts of West Bengal, Andhra, and Tamil Nadu. These are historically highly developed places, and they grew slower over time. And catch-ups, on the other hand, are the oranges. They are the ones that grew faster over time. The green ones are the leaders, and the lighter color is the laggards. So the good news is that we find more catch-ups than laggards. So leaders and laggards tend to be fewer than catch-ups and slowdowns overall. So 75% of all districts fall into either slowdown or catch-up levels. So I won't go into the details of which districts and states are what that we can see, but I want to point out two things here. A minute ago, I had said that there are patterns that we can see. There's variation, a lot of variation, because we have similar categories all over the country. But you can tell a state by what's in it. So you see some states that have only two colors. So orange and green are high growth sort of districts, and the lighter colors are low growth. So we do see that categorization, and what we find is that if catch-ups are growing faster than slowdowns, and slowdowns are slowing down, that's the first hint we got from these data about convergence. So catch-ups make up 37% of all districts. Slowdowns make up 38% of all districts. So they are the dominant patterns, and that's convergent with, that is consistent with convergence. There's the red dots are the cities and metro regions. So I'll just point out that it's very interesting that most of the cities are in slow growth, slowdown areas, traditionally well developed, but slowing down. But some cities buck that trend. So you see Hyderabad, and you see Bangalore, and you see Chennai a little bit, also Jaipur and Raipur. These are places that seem to be, and this is not, the data don't suggest, we didn't test for it, but they seem to suggest that they're surrounded by leaders or growing areas. So for others who are doing more detailed research, it would be very interesting to dig down and see what are the growth linkages with the hinterland of these cities, and how does it contrast with some of the other cities that are not doing the same. So how many minutes do I have? I don't want to go on. Rajat, if you just tell me, I can then pace myself accordingly.
Well, this is very interesting. So maybe you could take another 7 minutes. Is that good?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I'll try to be fast. So here, as I said, that we were surprised that we are seeing that catch-ups are growing faster, and the reasons that I mentioned. So then we went and tested for this and estimated the pace of convergence and what they call the half-life of catch-up using the Barrow-Salai-Martin method. So what we find here is that overall, in this post-reform period, Indian states have been converging at the rate of 0.8% per year. Indian districts have been converging at the rate of 1.26 or 1.3% per year. And cities, the 479 cities, have been converging the fastest at 3.6% per year. So on the face of it, if you have more cities, that enhances your ability to pull others along. So it seems to suggest that, and for other reasons, the data are constructed that way, that urbanization does, help you converge. But what's noteworthy is that, so this is a useful, very a hopeful finding, because what it signifies is that we also found evidence of sigma convergence, which is that absolute differences between the richer and poorer districts have also been falling, although slowly. So in one sense, it's good news that the disparities that would have worsened if we had found divergence is not what we find. However, the sobering finding is that the rate of convergence is not fast enough for us to be able to catch up in any reasonable point in a period of time. So if you look at other large economies like the US, their states and districts converge at around 2% per year for a long period. And China had various rates of convergence in different periods, but some were 4%, but a lot of the periods were above 3%. And our states are only 0.8%. So this is just a picture to show the convergence that is happening, the downward sloping curve for the district, states, and cities. And here is the second sobering pattern in this result, that although if we look at the entire period 92 to 2013, we find convergence of 0.8%, the time periods in between have behaved very differently. So we split up and disaggregated the growth in the 2 decades, 92 to 2001, and then 2001 to 2013. And we found that the rates of convergence were very high in 92 to 2001, and they slowed down considerably in the second decade, so that over that entire period, that high rate of the 92 to 2001 period is overwhelming the entire process. So to give you an example, so this downward curve shows that, okay, there was a steep fall after 95, and then it tends to have flattened out or slowed down. And what we find is that the half-life of convergence in the 92 to 2001 period for states was 64 years. That in 64 years, you could remove half the disparity between the richest and the poorest states. And in the next decade, 2001 to 2013, despite all the investments that were made in the Golden Quadrilateral and GNRDM and other things, we find that the half-life increases to 103 years, from 64 to 103. So they were converging at 1.1% in the first decade, and that convergence rate fell to 0.67. And the same thing happened at the district level. It's only the cities that bucked that trend. So therefore, to conclude, the point here is that, from a spatial equity perspective, it's a hopeful finding that we are finding convergence, and we would hope that this would generate interest in others to do similar things, use light to test this, in all kinds of other ways, so that we can have a deeper body of work around this. However, and these, the rates of convergence are slower than other places that have developed faster, and they are slowing down. So they're not being sustained, which means that growth has become relatively more uneven in the last decades. So what does that mean? I mean, does it mean that the better off states and districts have been able to disproportionately take advantage of all the investments that have happened of late and make the most of them? Or is it, of course, it's not one factor, there are many factors, or is it the fact that we have pretty low rates of internal migration in India? But that's something that's slowing down convergence. From a trade perspective, slower convergence can also be linked to internal barriers of mobility and trade. And so GST has been in a debate for a long time, and there's evidence that it's probably important to do that. But there's also agency that really matters. And China's example is quite interesting, where they have consistently invested pretty significantly in pulling their lagging regions up, so that it's not something of, let the rising tide pick all boats or pull up all boats, state policy, central policy, and local policies will have to actively pull the poor along if we are going to, go back to higher rates of convergence. So a closer scrutiny of policies, institutions, and arrangements that have shaped these patterns of regional development is pretty warranted, one finds. So I'll just maybe conclude with this urban form results. So this is a picture of night lights of Delhi, as you can see. So to understand how urban form is associated with economic growth, we followed 3 steps. First, we used night lights to identify urban extent, because as I said a minute ago, that we didn't want to go by just the administrative boundaries, but we wanted to see where the footprint of growth actually is. So we used this radiance calibrated night lights, which allows one to do that. Then we built a series of urban form measures, about 4 of them, using population land scan data. And then we linked the two and looked at the relationship between urban form and economic growth during this period. So the findings here again are that the more compact cities grew faster. Those cities that saw most of the growth in portions that were already urbanized, relative to those that were not urbanized but became urbanized later, that is the fringes, grew faster. But there was also heterogeneity in patterns. So this is just a picture that shows how the urban extent was identified. And this picture just shows that it's pretty close, and this imposes it on Google Earth, and you can so see that it does capture the cities quite closely. It's not perfect. Then we looked at urban extent over time. So here the 2 images are from 2002 and 2011. So what we did was we looked at the boundary of growth in 2002, and then we looked at the boundary of growth in 2011. So the orange was the boundary of growth in 2002, and the blue is the boundary of growth in 2011. And then by making these differences, we were able to calculate that the growth in light that we see over this time period, how much of that was intensive, that is inside the yellow line, and how much of it was extensive, that is in the new area that was urbanized. So based on that, we had these different measures, and this is density profiles, that is how they change. And it's so interesting. We have these for all the cities, and of course we look for patterns within them. But the point I just want to make here is that on the top panel are the metro cities, bottom panel are large secondary cities. This is population data, and this is just for 2002. And we can't compare Landscan with 2011 because of, again, observation data. But what we find, the point basically here is that if you look at Delhi, it has a lot of intensity of density. There's a population calibrated in the inside. But look at the long fringe that's developing. Look at the long, sort of low, sort of under the radar growth that is happening and moving outwards, so extensive growth. In Mumbai, on the other hand, one finds the creation of sub-centers over time, that there is density, but you clearly see these pockets. In Kolkata, there is again it's a bit like Mumbai, but it's also a bit like Delhi. So it's more, sort of spread out, but also dense. So anyway, I won't spend, so the point here is that there is significant heterogeneity which should be mined to understand what's going on. This is using lights, and I just want to show you how they change over time. And we're looking at this, closely. So this shows that, as expected, density gradients fall from the center, and there's heterogeneity. That leads us to these 4 measures. I won't dwell on each one of them, but we build on work that Berthaud did and that Harari recently did. So these are density gradients, which I just showed dispersion, that is, how far away are you from the center, and a centrality index, which measures whether you're monocentric or polycentric, and then a Gini spatial inequality index, which says, did a lot of growth happen in some parts of the city, small parts, small areas, or was it generally distributed? So using all of these, we calculate the growth, and what we find is this robust relationship, significant at the 1% level, that controlling for a city's initial size, those cities that had compact form in 2002 grew faster by the end of that period, by 2012. And in fact, if we look at the intensive versus extensive growth, we find that a 10% increase in a city's growth, intensive growth, that is growth within existing boundaries, had this is statistically significant, effect of raising its growth rate by 0.4 to 0.5 percentage points, which meant that if without that it was growing at 1%, now it would grow at 1.4 or 1.5%. It's pretty significant. So that's very interesting. So this implies that for a city, given initial size, compactness is associated with subsequent growth, but the heterogeneity that I showed at the beginning shows that it's not one size fits all. So when we say, oh, compact, go for compact growth, that doesn't mean anything. It has to be customized to the local level. So I'll just end with this example of Surat and Kochi. These are two cities with similar population size, but very different urban forms and different growth outcomes. So Surat was relatively more compact than Kochi, which was spread out over the entire space, and the red line is the centroid, using which we measured our measures. And so this table gives the results. So if you look at the population, it was pretty similar. But if you look at rho, beta, the dispersion and the density profiles. So the density profile, the beta, Surat had a steeper density profile than Kochi did. And the distance of an average person from the center, in a sense, was much more in Kochi, the first one, rho, than it was in Surat. Similarly, the Gini is different. And look at the growth rate. Surat grew at 4.1% during this period, and Kochi grew at 1.7%. So this is, of course, not a Barcelona, Atlanta example, but it comes close and it illustrates what it is that we are talking about. So I'll end with this, although I have some other things too about transportation, but I think it's time to end. For compact, more compact Indian cities have on average grown more rapidly than extensive form or relatively sprawled cities. So this is generally consistent with international evidence that compactness to some extent supports faster growth. But there is this point about heterogeneity, and the need to think about, to unpack what compactness means is extremely important, especially in the Indian case. So if compactness is associated with faster growth, however, in India, over this period of 92 to 2013, almost half of India's urban expansion, or 44% of it, occurred in the extensive margin. The kind of Delhi growth that I showed you, and not just Delhi, but these other places, which was spread out, low density, all over, so that you have to have longer pipes to serve everybody, or more generally the issues that we all talk about. So growth in the periphery. So which suggests that if we can do things differently and move towards more transit-oriented or more grounded, and more intensive growth, there is a dividend to be had by raising the growth level of half the country's cities. So I'll just end here. This was about transportation. But I'll end here. I think we've gone long enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Meenu. I think that was a lot of information and a lot of good data. I hope you'll stand by and hear the panel discussion, and then if there are questions, you could address them. But without taking more time, may I request Professor Anil Markande to make the presentation on the bottom-up BAU that we've done for Surat, Pune, Indore, and Bangalore, divided 2 cities each between ICRIER and WRI. Thank you for being there, Professor Anil.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Yes. I'm afraid I'll have to have some help with the presentation because I can't bring it up on my screen, but Arsi said that she would put the presentation up for you and then change the slides as I speak. Is that happening or what?
Yes, Professor Markande, that's happening. Please do go ahead.
Okay, good. Well, not to take more time. Well, firstly, let me say it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry I can't be there physically, but at least I'm keeping my environmental and carbon footprint down. And also, secondly, I'd like to say that this work is very much the shared work of many people at ICRIER and at WRI. So my role is a relatively small one of trying to help to bring the whole thing together. The important task here has been that we felt a major factor in urban development is the way in which the different forms of infrastructure are provided, that they can be provided from public sources, private sources, and from self-provision. And each of these has a cost, has a private cost, but it also has a full cost, which is more than just the cost which is borne by the beneficiary. And the purpose of the exercise was to look very carefully at the costs, not just the private direct costs, but also these other cost components. So if we move to the motivation slide, which says what the purpose of the study is, it's to understand current patterns and provision. And we analyze how each service is currently being provided in the 4 cities that we've selected, we just mentioned, and how and at what level these services are being consumed, what the unmet demand is for each service. And then we've developed some models to assess the cost of these services, both in economic and in environmental terms. These costs, estimates of costs of self-provisioning, for example, diesel generators instead of gridded power, groundwater or vented water instead of piped connections, and private transport instead of public transit, will help us to see what would be the true costs of further development in the cities, where different patterns of development. A more smart development would have different costs from a more expansive development. So if we move to the next slide, it shows you how the different cost components are related to the services. The 4 services we looked at are transport, energy, water, and sanitation. Water and sanitation is separated out. And we have 4 different elements in the costs. The direct costs are, of course, the capital and an operation and maintenance cost of providing the services. And there's an aspect there I'll come back to. The indirect costs vary. In the case of transport, there will be costs of congestion, costs of accidents. In the case of energy, there are indirect costs would be time taken to collect, for example, certain forms of energy, if it's firewood, or the case of water, if it's time taken to collect water, if it's not provided directly to the house. And then for sanitation, there are also indirect costs of this kind. The health costs are essentially costs of mortality, premature mortality and morbidity, and these costs also arise mainly because of outdoor air pollution emissions resulting from the burning of fossil fuels related to transport and energy, in the case where energy is provided from fossil fuels or from fuel wood. In the case of water, the cost of risks of contamination from water which has not been treated, and then similarly for sanitation. And then the last component are climate costs, which are costs from the emissions of CO2 or methane in the case of water and sanitation. Now, what we try to do is to look at each of these cost components, and then if we're doing them in monetary terms, we can add them up to give us what is the true cost of providing the service by the different means that I've mentioned earlier. That's public service, private service, and self-provision. So we move to the next slide. And these are the four cities we looked at, mostly the two in Western India, Surat and Pune, Indore, which is more or less in the center of the country, and Bangalore, which is in the south. The cities are very different areas. Bangalore, the largest, 800 square kilometers and 8 million people. Indore, the smallest, at 134 square kilometers and about 2 million people. But these differences in size and location, you'll see, make a lot of difference, are related to lots of differences in heterogeneity in the way in which numbers turn out in terms of services provided and costs. If we look at the next slide, these are the services analyzed. We have, as I said, three kinds of provision: public, private, and self-provided. And for water and sanitation, public services are, of course, public water supply, tap water, sewerage connections, or public toilets. Private provision is essentially water tankers and bottled water, and then self-provided are tube wells and bore wells. And then we have households with septic tanks or households with pit latrines, and then also the practice of open defecation. And then in the case of transport, public provision is buses, different buses including transit systems, rapid transit systems. Private provisions are rickshaws, taxis, corporate buses, and school buses, and then self-provided are cars, two-wheelers, bicycles, and walking. And then for energy, the public provision is either electricity, LPG, PNG, or kerosene. Private provision is open access electricity systems or commercially provided diesel generation. And then self-provision is people either having their own generation sets or using firewood. So we have very different ways in which services are provided and have very different costs. Let me now turn to the inferences from the study, so we can slip to the first slide, which shows access to public services in each city. And you'll see here that there are significant differences in the extent to which public services are provided. For example, in the case of transport, Bangalore has the highest. 28% of trips are made by public transport, by public bus, and Surat is only 1%. In Indore and Pune are in between. In the case of water, the households with water connections supplied by public utility, there are also significant variations, with Indore the lowest at 57% and Pune the highest at 98%. Sanitation, Indore is the lowest, 62%, Surat the highest at 86%. In the case of energy, most households have access to electricity provided by the public utilities, figures around 98% in all cases. But the major differences in city is in the quality of the service. So in the case of Surat, we have virtually in Pune, virtually no periods of blackouts of failure of provision from the utility, whereas in Bangalore and Indore, that failure is quite frequent. And then the last one is the provision of households, access to LPG. That also varies a lot. And because that varies, that I think would be the preferred fuel for cooking. Households, the extent to which they have to depend on kerosene varies a lot. So kerosene use is highest in Surat at 20%, but lowest in Indore is around 5%. High levels of use of kerosene and fuel wood and firewood are also associated with high environmental and health costs, which will come up when we look at the cost data. We turn to the next slide. You have the transport demand. Here you again find quite significant differences in modes across cities. So there are lots of trips made this is just the total number of trips made by different mode. But one of the key findings is that two-wheelers remain the predominant mode of motorized travel in all the cities we've looked at. This will have a big the future plans and provisioning services and and the costs will depend a lot on these modal splits that we've got here. The next slide gives us the costs of transport now added up, and here we have the costs of buses, auto rickshaws, school, other taxis, cars, two-wheelers, bicycles, and walking. And we've split up the costs between those which are, if you like, which we call the direct costs. Then we have the indirect personal costs, health costs, and climate costs. Now, the indirect personal costs of congestion and time are significant for walking, bicycles, and two-wheelers in all the cities. They can also, these cost components are also important for cars and buses, but the extent to which they form an important part of the total cost varies from one city to another. Health and climate costs turn out actually to be quite a small part of total cost, but with the most contribution coming from two-wheelers and cars, which in a way was surprising because when we added up these costs, we would thought maybe these health costs would be significant given the problem of air pollution that many cities are facing, many Indian cities are facing. But the monetized value of these health costs is not very high. And that has implications for the way in which we might want to address the problems of air pollution in smart cities in the future. We turn to the next slide. This gives us the cost structure for electricity. And here we see that all households, all cities have electricity for lighting and for light industrial use. They're high access. And this is true, but the cost per kilowatt hour varies a lot. So we have figures in Pune at around 9 rupees a kilowatt hour, and the lowest is in Bangalore at 4.5. Surat is the only city that provides health costs associated with electricity and this is due to the presence of thermal generation in close proximity to the city. The cost differences do raise the point that some cities have higher levels of subsidy for generation, and therefore the direct costs vary for that reason. And these differences in direct costs may also be a factor which is responsible for the quality of the service. At the same time, what's not shown in the figure is that two of the cities, Surat, is actively involved in promoting energy efficiency measures, and this corporation runs its own renewable energy plants for wind, solar, and biogas. And these its energy-saving measures and these managed to reduce energy consumption by about 48 million kilowatt hours in 2014. Likewise, in the case of Pune, the corporation has been actively involved in increasing its portfolio of renewable energy, and the municipal corporation runs about 20 biogas plants of 5 million tons each, and a 300 million ton waste energy plant producing compressed biogas. These factors help to reduce the energy demand and the health and environment and the health cost, particularly the climate cost of energy, significantly. In the case of Pune, the corporation has also made solar water heating compulsory for certain buildings and has adopted a green rating system to evaluate building designs to promote this kind of energy efficiency. The next slide looks at cooking fuels. And here you see that LPG has now become a fairly high level of use in these urban areas, but there is dependence still on kerosene and firewood. Now, the extent to which kerosene firewood is used seems to depend a little bit on how much the boundary of the city is expanded, and because LPG provision to the periphery is poor, and so the more spread out the city has become in recent years, the higher this figure will be. So, for example, we have low kerosene use in Indore and Pune, 5 and 8% respectively. In Bangalore and Surat is 16 and 20%. The households in these newly added areas in Bangalore and Surat continuing to use inefficient cooking fuels as stoves, and that accounts for a high health cost from these sources. Of course, firewood has always got a high health cost, and you can see that in the picture. Where LPG has a very low health cost, which also shows up in the picture. So in future, they move towards, if one can, to make provision of LPG and try and phase out the use of kerosene and firewood would be an important part of keeping the full costs of cooking fuels lower. Let's turn to the next slide, which turns to water, looks at water. And here we're looking at the provision of tap water from treated sources is a major provider in all the cities. But private tube wells and bore wells still play a big role in Indore and Bangalore. Now, this has implications for sustainability as well as health, because the water which is being drawn from these sources is not always being drawn in a sustainable way, and it's also not well treated. Vended water is significant in Indore and Bangalore and is, of course, a very expensive source. We turn to the next slide. Are you changing the slides okay, RC? Is everything all right? Hello?
Going perfectly fine, thank you.
Okay, so here we can see the full cost in rupees per kiloliter, and you'll see that, of course, vended water is the most expensive, with high indirect and health costs. Untreated sources of tap water and tube wells have a lower cost, but they still have a significant part which is health related. Tap water from treated sources has the lowest overall cost, but is limited in being in supply because of the high upfront investment cost, and because even though it has low overall cost, there is still a significant subsidy. So the municipality does not recover those low costs, the cost from the beneficiaries. Turning to sanitation, we can see here an interesting picture that, of course, the connection to the sewage is by far the biggest source, but households still use septic tanks quite significantly, as the use of public toilets, and sadly, open defecation is still practiced in these 4 cities. If you look at the full cost of sanitation on the next slide, we see that the most highest quality service, and the one which is most desirable, which is the sewerage connection, is also by far the most expensive, most costly. But the low cost of open defecation and pit latrines do not capture the poor quality of these services. And so there is, in a sense, an incomplete comparison between these two. And septic tanks can also have environmental costs, as do other forms than sewerage connections, which are not fully captured in this picture. So now let me turn now to some of these are findings from the study, which we looked at the different cost components. What can they tell us about the patterns of what we would like to see in future development in the cities? If we turn to the first slide, which is a city level approach, and this is a picture only for Bangalore, but one of the things here is that the transportation options have a strong link to spatial extents of development. So opting for public transport as the dominant mode can limit the spatial extent of Bangalore in the future to about 1,800 square kilometers, as opposed to about 3,500 square kilometers if we go for more car-centric development. So similar to transport, water supply and energy also have clear links to spatial extents. Currently, most of the public supply in Bangalore is limited to the outer ring road, which is the old Bangalore metropolitan region. Now, considering that the Water Supply Agency, the BWSSB, is under significant debt and severely limited in its ability to expand services, alternative modes of water supply need to be identified for the new growth areas. Now, we think that distributed networks could be one solution. Distributed networks, in addition to supplying water more efficiently, can also reduce energy costs. You can see this from the 2 pictures in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. Water supply for Bangalore is pumped from the Kidwai, which is 100 kilometers from the city, and the map at the bottom right shows the costs of water in Bangalore without adding the climate costs of pumping water. If we add the climate costs of pumping the water, the picture changes to the one on the bottom left. So clearly pumping water from large distances adds significant costs, both energy and climate, and an integrated approach to managing spatial growth would require understanding the current patterns in service provision, and identifying an optimal solution which links land expansion with service provision. The next slide shows us again for Bangalore what we think could be a way of resolving the combination of centralized and decentralized services. So we have the centralized services in the inner core, and then the outside in those marked circles, the darker circles, We have decentralized services for low and medium access zones. So the combination of the two would be a way of providing the services in a more effective, in a way which is more effective and takes account of the fiscal and other constraints that the cities are facing. The next slide makes another recommendation which relates to the current, comparing the current linear paradigm of take, make and dispose, which is clearly unsustainable as it does lead to significant resource depletion. Now, when public supply is inadequate, dependence on unregulated self-provision leads to an increased depletion of resources and negative impacts on the quality of the resource. So circular models, which we think have a way of getting around this problem, would promote wastewater treatment and reuse, which can help augment the water supply, help generate renewable energy and eliminate land and water pollution, while also serving to provide some form of climate mitigation by eliminating short-lived climate pollutants. So such examples, as I said, have already been seen in Surat and Pune, where treated wastewater is sold to industrial areas, and biomethanation converts municipal solid waste to energy, which is used in wastewater treatment. But such projects are still preliminary and need to be scaled up for widespread benefits to be realized. Now, distributed generation is also has an important role through renewable energy with storage, and policies to support such systems can liberate rich and poor communities from the use of diesel gensets, kerosene and firewood use, while also serving the climate mitigation goals. So Karnataka's recent approval of gross metering scheme to allow rooftop solar generators a higher financial benefit per kilowatt hour of electricity can potentially trigger a widespread uptake of this kind of rooftop solar generation in urban areas, such as Bangalore. The next slide we want to turn to, I think, is an important policy recommendation which follows from this work, and that is the dependence now on much more targeted subsidies. A lot of the problem of expanding the highest quality, lowest full cost service is that the utilities do not recoup the full cost and therefore cannot finance this supply of that kind of service. They can't recoup them from user tariffs. In India as a whole, irrespective of income class, $3 of subsidies provided for every dollar of tariff paid for water used. As a result, we need to have some form of change, and here are some of the reasons. The flat rates for each user, we currently have flat rates for each user category. Although there are user tariff slabs, these account for what volume of consumption only, not upon the status of the consumer, and externalities are not factored into the user tariffs. So we think there's a role for targeted subsidies so that they're provided to those who really need them, low-income households living in slum areas. And then we need to think about removing the uniform subsidies to all consumers. And my last slide is really to summarize. We think that the evidence is that full costs are almost always higher than the direct costs borne by the beneficiary. So future supply patterns of infrastructure really ought to calculate the full cost and design systems that minimize those costs rather than the direct costs. Now, one reason we have this divergence between the full cost and the direct cost is the subsidies on direct costs. And as I said, this needs to be addressed in some form. The other is that the health and environmental costs are hardly ever included in setting the price. Now, it's impossible to move to full cost pricing in one go, but I think over time we need to move in that direction in all the major urban areas. Now, full cost pricing will support a move to cities that are less spread out and will encourage cities with good public services because the public provision will be better financed. But affordability will be a problem, and this issue of targeted subsidies needs further work. So let me stop here. I'm sorry if I've taken a little too much time, but there's a lot to say, and we had a lot of work which went into this exercise, which is still, I think, work in progress. Thank you.